This panel is entitled Documentation and Accountability, Genocide in Gaza. The panel will examine the destruction of Gaza through multiple perspectives, assessing the damage and destruction to healthcare infrastructure, its effects on public health, and the implications as well for the legal question of genocide. We'll also be exploring dimensions of loss beyond physical casualties, the erasure of cultural heritage, the disruption and destruction of educational institutions, and the unraveling of Gaza's social fabric. How has Gaza's healthcare system been destroyed by Israel, and what are the long-term effects on public health? What are the dimensions of loss beyond these physical casualties, and how do events in Gaza challenge conventional understandings of genocide? We're very fortunate to have several experts with us to provide analysis on these questions. And before we begin, please allow me to remind you that there are question and answer cards that will be distributed by staff for those of you who want to submit a question for discussion. If you'd like to submit one, please hold your card up, and a staff member will come around to collect it ahead of the question and answer session after introductory remarks from our panel. Those of you who are watching online, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, or again, via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. I have the honor of sharing the stage this morning with a very distinguished panel. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting introductory remarks. At the end of the table, Yara is Assistant Professor at the School of Global Health Management and Informatics at the University of Central Florida, and also a colleague here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. as a non-resident fellow. She will be followed by Jehad Abusalim, seated here next to me, who is the Executive Director at the Institute for Palestine Studies, USA, and a Palestinian writer from Gaza. Segal, seated next to Jehad, will speak after that. He is Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Endowed Professor in the Study of Modern Genocide at Stockton University. And last but not least, of course, Leah Whitson will round out our panel, and she is Executive Director of Dawn, Democracy in the Arab World Now. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today and sharing your insights with us. And I will invite now Yara to begin with her introductory remarks. Yara.
Thank you, Yousef, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and engaging in this conversation about the present reality for Palestinians in Gaza. My comments today have two aims. One is to offer a current assessment of the damage to the health system and the subsequent health outcomes of that, and two, to discuss the expected health impact of survivors moving forward. But first, I want to take a brief moment to quote some testimonies from survivors in Gaza to ensure that we center their lived experiences. I find too often, especially when you start getting into these larger and larger numbers, it becomes easy for them to become abstractions, and we forget the humanity behind them. So the first testimony was just published a couple weeks ago at the end of May 2025 from a poet living in North Gaza. Quote, "The hunger I'm experiencing now is not what I imagined. It's not just an empty feeling in your stomach. It's a numbness that spreads from the gut to the brain. It blurs memories, weakens vision, and turns every thought into a deep excavation that the mind can't bear. Hunger steals the simplest human abilities: concentration, patience, sensation, the desire to say something. Thinking becomes a luxury. Words become weights that cannot be lifted." Unquote. This second testimony from a physician who was at Nasser Hospital, quote, "An attack hit an area where Israeli forces had repeatedly advised displaced people to go. We first understood something bad had happened from the enormous explosions that were closer to the hospital than ever before. Chaos ensued at the hospital. Our team ran to the emergency room to receive those in need of medical care. One of the patients, a 3-year-old, was injured. Her parents were standing right next to her, worried as she looked directly at me. She was breathing, so she must be okay, I thought. But as I took her bandage off, I realized her entire left thigh was peeled down to the bone. The third testimony from a psychologist. Quote, "When we say that there is no safe place in Gaza today, we are not just talking about the shelling. There isn't even a safe place in people's minds. They live in a state of constant alert. They can't sleep. They think that at any moment they are going to die, that if they fall asleep, they won't be able to react quickly and run away or protect their family. Once I found a colleague on the stairs. He's usually a very energetic and upbeat person, but he was leaning his head on his knees. He was on the verge of tears and told me how exhausted he was. He asked me what he was supposed to do, where he should go, and when this war would stop. I had no answers to give him." These testimonies, as horrific and unbearable as they are, I think help to contextualize and serve as a reminder that these are not numbers, right? These are people who, despite living under siege and violence long before October 7th, long before even the blockade in 2007, were people, hopes, aspirations, dreams, and they're now struggling to survive as they witness the complete disintegration of everything they have known. And I think Jehad will touch on that in his comments. And these 3 testimonies also provide us with the contours of how health and the health system in Gaza has completely collapsed. So unquestionable hunger, which has become kind of the story of the moment, endless attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure that lead to horrific injuries and death, and the mental toll of what it really means to live through and witness endless atrocities. You know, we often think of the survivors as the lucky ones. Many of them do not conceptualize themselves that way. According to the most recent reports, the Ministry of Health in Gaza has documented at least about 55,000 Palestinians have been confirmed killed, and an additional 125,000 more have been injured since October 7th. We know that women, children, and the elderly make up at least 70% of those killed, although, of course, we acknowledge that many of the men who have been killed have also been civilians, not militants. We know that this is an undercount, considering those still missing and many whose bodies remain trapped under rubble or are otherwise unretrievable. And there's been several studies that have sought to predict or estimate what the genuine death toll is. While we won't know this for months or if not years, we know that it's probably many tens of thousands more at a minimum. We also know that many of the injured, including tens of thousands of children, have extremely severe injuries, including amputations, some with multiple amputations of multiple limbs, that will require lifelong treatment, and it's unclear where they will get that treatment, where they will live. And at least 17,000 children have lost both parents, making Gaza the site of the largest orphan crisis in modern history. But it is not just the material conditions of mass destruction that is killing people in Gaza today. In just the second half of May 2025, more than 2,700 children under 5 years of age were diagnosed with acute malnutrition, and the World Health Organization reported that at least 57 children have died in those conditions. Not a single one of Gaza's 564 health service facilities remains fully functional. Most are completely non-functional, including its 36 hospitals. There's only one partially functional health facility in all of North Gaza, and it's primarily only able to triage trauma cases. If you have cancer or some other ailment, they have no services to offer you. My team at the Palestine Program for Health and Human Rights is currently working on a study with World Health Organization hospital functionality data, and we found that as early as November 2023, so just weeks after this started, there was already not a single fully functional hospital left in Gaza. While some of that is because the hospitals were damaged or destroyed by bombing, in other cases it's because the siege limited fuel and entry of other supplies so that local health officials decided to consolidate efforts and close smaller and specialty hospitals early on so they could focus on the larger hospitals like El-Shifa, many of which were also subsequently destroyed. And it's not just the hospitals, but the staff that work in them. At least 1,400 health workers have been killed. This is physicians, deans of medical schools, highly trained specialists, medical students, paramedics, everyone. Hundreds more have been kidnapped and detained in Israeli jails. where those released have reported torture, sexual abuse, and neglect. Many of those taken by the Israelis remain imprisoned, including Dr. Hassam Abu Safiya, the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, who was kidnapped very famously in December 2024 and remains in Israeli custody, where his lawyer reports he's experiencing torture and neglect, including for medical needs. We know from many previous settings of armed conflict, including recent settings like Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, that most people that die do not die from battle-related injuries. So as, disturbing as the images from bombing, snipers, raids, et cetera, have been, it's estimated that 3 to 5 times more people will die in the years after an armed conflict from indirect causes, like spread of infectious disease, lack of access to healthcare for people with cancer and other ailments, increases in maternal and infant mortality, and lack of access to food and water. All of these threats are present in Gaza and have been for years. Palestinians and their allies have, for nearly a century, been warning that Israel's policies and practices towards Palestinians, both in what is now the occupied territories, but also for Palestinian citizens of Israel, were killing them in many ways, including controlling movement and access to healthcare. So today, this is just the natural culmination of these efforts. And these efforts are meant to drive Palestinians off their land by any means necessary, so that their land can be seized and settled by the Israeli state. We've also had significant infectious disease outbreaks in Gaza. There was, of course, the polio outbreak. I believe it started in June of this past summer. It led to partial paralysis in several children, and a number of other infections like skin rashes, respiratory ailments, waterborne illnesses, and others due to lack of infrastructure, unclean and overcrowded conditions, the complete breakdown in vaccinations for small children, and the lack of hygienic products. We even had physicians reporting that they were unable to wash their hands between procedures because there was no water or soap. There's approximately 10,000 cancer patients in Gaza, 1,000 people who require dialysis, 50,000 cardiovascular patients, 60,000 diabetics, all who need regular diagnostics, treatments, pharmaceuticals, none of whom have been able to receive any of that in the past 2 years. Unless Israel grants them, of course, a permit for a medical evacuation, which has been, is a whole other issue I think we could have a whole other conference about, but many of them have been denied or delayed such that the person dies while awaiting their permit. There are about 130 births per day, with women often having no access to prenatal care, no trained medical personnel at the birth, and no access to any medical care the mother or child may need in case of a complicated pregnancy or delivery. And of course, the number of miscarriages has increased by 300%. More babies are being born premature and underweight, with their mother often too malnourished to produce milk, and there being little to no formula available to feed the babies. Some mothers have reported being only able to offer their infant sugar water because they have nothing else to give them. I recognize this is a lot of information and statistics. I think the important takeaway, though, is just looking at how multifaceted and intentional the nature of these attacks on life itself are. To echo our keynote, if you consider 3 of the 5 acts as defined by the Genocide Convention, number 1, causing serious bodily or mental harm, number 2, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and number 3, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, it is becoming increasingly difficult, to put it diplomatically, to make any argument that just in the health sector, let alone every other sector, Israel has not already been committing these acts. So what about the survivors? This may feel premature because as we speak, there is ongoing bombing, ongoing siege, and deprivation, but there will be survivors. Some have already fled. Some are in Egypt. I know several have settled in South Africa. Wherever they could go, they have gone for those who could afford to leave. But there's at least around 2 million people left, to the best of our current knowledge. We know from previous literature on settings of genocide that among the most lingering effects are the consequences of untreated infectious and non-infectious diseases and psychiatric disorders, especially post-traumatic stress disorder. We're also concerned about the long-term and even intergenerational effects of malnutrition and malnourishment. Those who are children today who have been living in these conditions where they may be eating simply bread, most days, if they're able to eat, will experience stunted growth that is not reversible, even if they are able to receive an adequate diet moving forward. There's also evidence that long-term undernourishment results in poor educational achievement and behavioral issues for the lifespan. And malnutrition in pregnant women causes the most severe physical consequences for the unborn child, such as increased risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. So we're witnessing a health catastrophe, but we're also witnessing the future generations will have to deal with the consequences of this health catastrophe. There's also the long-term risks of environmental exposures, bombs. There's unexploded munitions all over Gaza, the destruction of water treatment and sanitation facilities that have released dangerous chemicals into the water, into the soil. And we know, just looking at Iraq, that children born in these settings are more likely to have congenital or abnormalities and cancers. So I want to end with a very brief thought on reconstruction, because this is a question that I get asked a lot. Rebuild the health system, what will it take? What do we need? And we can talk about the billions of dollars that it will take, or the specialized equipment, or how are we going to train hundreds of medical professionals to replace those that have been killed. But I think it's become explicitly clear that the Israelis at this point have no intention to allow Palestinians to return and rebuild in Gaza. Multiple Israeli politicians, including Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, have expressed that the horrific conditions they have created will result in mass migration, and they call it voluntary migration, which many have confirmed is the intended goal. Create conditions where life is not suitable, and those who survive will have every incentive to then try to leave and settle elsewhere. Research shows us that populations will choose to stay on their land as long as humanly possible, in even the most fragile of conditions. But their one motivator to finally leave is when the healthcare system becomes destroyed or inaccessible. That is kind of a sign that it's the end of the road for many people. Recent evidence from Syria, where hospitals were bombed as a strategy of displacement, has made this clear. So as we discuss the collapse of the healthcare system and the humanitarian impacts of that, I think we must also see it in the broader picture of Israeli aims to take Palestinians off their land. In the current political environment, I see absolutely no barrier that will prevent Israel from doing exactly this. And we could have a whole other conversation about how this is manifesting in the West Bank at the same time in different ways. Hospitals and healthcare workers are offered special protections in international law. For decades, Israel has violated Palestinian rights, including their right to health, with absolutely no consequence. Thus, while much of what I have said is shocking and perhaps unbelievable, especially if you read testimonies, it has all been entirely predictable and predicted. The question now becomes what comes next, and I look forward to hearing the contributions of my colleagues on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yara, for that very thorough and sobering assessment. I want to turn it over now to Jehad Abusalim, who will share his introductory remarks with us.
Okay, thank you so much, Yousef, and thank you so much to all of you for being here today. I want to build on what Yara said, and especially the point that she raised towards the end of her presentation. The data and figures we heard today about the destruction of Gaza's health sector, what I'm also going to talk about today, raise a question that has been asked repeatedly since the beginning of this genocide. Why target hospitals? Why target maternity wards, emergency rooms, and neonatal intensive care units? Our memory isn't that short. We remember the reports from late 2023 that were even published in mainstream Western media about dead babies who were found in neonatal care units after the Israeli military forcibly evacuated hospitals like Al-Nasser Hospital in Gaza City. So when these things unfold, maybe we protest the brutality and sometimes question these acts and ask ourselves why. And I addressed this question early during, I addressed this question early during this genocide. The answer does not lie in military logic, but in political intent. You cannot understand the systematic targeting of Gaza's health sector without understanding Israel's objectives in this genocidal war. That objective, as Yara mentioned, is not the military dismantlement or defeat of a specific armed group. It is the dismantling, disintegration, and annihilation of the Gaza Strip as a society and as a population. Health infrastructure, which is by definition foundational and existential to any society, becomes a primary target under that logic. So if you want to dismantle a society, you begin with destroying hospitals, and this is Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. If emergency rooms can be bombed as a matter of routine, if NICU units can be taken out of service repeatedly and across different parts of the Gaza Strip, then it is reasonable to ask also what is the status of other core systems: education, cultural institutions, agriculture, and archives. The data I'm presenting today comes from a set of documentation platforms developed and maintained by the Institute for Palestine Studies. These platforms are designed to track the full scope of destruction across multiple sectors in the Gaza Strip and beyond, and they are continuously updated with verified data, and they serve as a resource for researchers, policymakers, experts, and of course for future generations. As of October 2023, IPS has launched 6 databases with a 7th forthcoming. Only the health database is currently available in both Arabic and English, and the others are available only in Arabic for now. Some of these databases cover the destruction, document the destruction of Gaza's education sector. Others track the violations that prisoners and detainees suffer in Israeli detention camps. There is a database that I will talk about a little bit today that documents the destruction of Gaza's environment and agriculture. Another database on the destruction of cultural centers, libraries, museums, and heritage sites, which I will talk about in detail as well. And there are also 2 databases that document Israeli aggression in both the West Bank in general and in Jerusalem, in particular following post-October 7th. These databases, which you can find on our website, are structured to provide evidence for documentation and accountability, and they serve as a public record of destruction and are intended to support in the future legal claims, justice efforts, and of course historical preservation. So a few notes about the destruction of agriculture and land in Gaza. This is an area of the ongoing genocide that receives less attention than other sectors, but the scale of impact here is significant, it's measurable, and it is beyond the ability of many to fathom. To begin with, Gaza's total agricultural land base is around 232,000 dunams. As of May 2025, more than 156,000 dunams have been damaged. That's roughly 2/3 of all cultivated land in the Gaza Strip. That's around 70% of Gaza's cultivated land. In terms of the majority of Gaza's agricultural activity was concentrated in places like Khan Yunis, in Gaza City, north and south of Gaza City, in areas north of Gaza, in areas like Beit Hanun, south of Gaza City in the middle area. These areas have been severely damaged. The northern governorates of the Gaza Strip have seen the heaviest destruction. In Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia, damage to farmland reached as high as 80% of total farmland. And these are probably outdated figures because, as we're talking, Israel, keeps expanding the scale of its genocidal assault. In Khan Yunis, also probably outdated because Israel is now doing in Khan Yunis what it's been doing in Rafah for months. The figure is around 61% and counting. This satellite footage that you see here, I got yesterday from Google Earth, which is up to date as of December 2024. This is the Zahra area or the Netzarim corridor, which is, no need to explain what you're looking at. It's pretty straightforward. Nothing is left here. Now, moving to infrastructure. And this is another example of what the destruction of farmland means. So we're not talking about Second Intifada style uprooting of, groves and orchards. We're talking about the complete and total annihilation and transformation of the geography and probably, rendering entire agricultural areas even unusable in the future due to the types of chemicals and pollution that also results from the constant bombardment. Water access, I will talk about this briefly. Water access is critical to agriculture and to other aspects of life, and it's been systematically targeted. As of the latest data, more than 1,500 agricultural wells, that's 68% of Gaza's irrigation wells, have been destroyed. 80% of greenhouses in Gaza have been destroyed. 35% of Gaza's agricultural land lies before the genocide unfolded in what was called the buffer zone, which expanded by now. These areas are completely erased and destroyed. 333,000 meters of water pipelines have been destroyed, and 655,000 meters of sewage infrastructure have been destroyed. And what does that mean for the population? More than 91% of the current population in the Gaza Strip, those who survived so far being killed, lack access to safe drinking water and hygiene and are subjected to a lot of terrible conditions, some of which Yara explained earlier. And more than 170,000 tons of solid waste are now piled across the Gaza Strip due to the collapse of water management services. I'm going to jump to education very quickly. Since the start of Israel's war on Gaza, the education sector has faced a level of destruction so widespread, so deliberate, it cannot be understood as anything other than systemic. As of May 2025, more than 672 school teachers and 213 university faculty members, this is for those who feel uncomfortable on campuses in the United States, more than 213 university faculty members have been killed. Over 14,500 school children have been killed. More than 985 university students have been killed. These are probably outdated numbers. At least 111 government schools have been completely destroyed. An additional 241 schools have sustained severe damage. 60 university buildings have been reduced to rubble. Among them are Gaza's leading institutions, Al-Azhar University, where I did my BA, the Islamic University, where I studied Hebrew, Al-Aqsa University, where family and friends and cousins went to school. Each of these institutions played a vital role in shaping not only the Palestinian academic life, but they played an important role in the civic and cultural life in Gaza as well. I'm going to, just for the sake of time, jump to the destruction of Gaza's cultural heritage. And this is meant to be the highlight of this presentation. Since October 2023, the cultural and historical infrastructure of Gaza has faced a campaign of destruction that is as deliberate and as it is systematic. According to documentation compiled by the Institute for Palestine Studies, the genocide has resulted in the complete destruction of nearly 40 cultural and artistic institutions, the obliteration of more than 20 libraries and archives, the targeting of at least 49 historical sites, including museums, mosques, churches, and archaeological landmarks. More than 55 cultural workers, dedicated cultural workers, have been killed. We're talking about important figures in Gazan society: poets, musicians, filmmakers, artists, and heritage experts. We're also talking about the systematic targeting of institutions and networks that hold and transmit collective identity in the Gaza Strip. Those who preserve, document, interpret, and imagine. These people are systematically targeted. What you're looking here is the main building of the historic Gaza municipality building in the heart of Gaza's old city. And this building is very important, and the municipality is very important because I'm going to talk about its archive. In her policy paper, Gaza's Archive and the Ongoing Destruction, scholar Rula Shahwan argues that the targeting of archives and libraries is not only about the erasure of history, but the erasure of time itself. She writes, and I quote, "Israel's repeated bombardment of archives, libraries, and cultural institutions is not incidental. It is part of a systematic policy to dismantle the material and symbolic infrastructure of Palestinian identity in Gaza." What you're looking here at is what remains of Gaza's municipal archives. The Gaza Municipality Archive held over 110,000 historical documents, including civil records, architectural plans, legal contracts, and maps. It was bombed during the early months of the genocide. Shahwan notes that this archive documented Gaza's civic evolution across Ottoman, British, Egyptian, and Palestinian Authority periods. Its loss is equivalent to the severing of Gaza's legal and municipal and civil memory. The Rashad al-Shawwa Cultural Center, one of Gaza's most important civic and cultural hubs, is now in rubble. Its archives, which contained documents of international events, art exhibits, and community gatherings, were destroyed. Artists like Asr al-Saqqa have spoken publicly about this loss as both professional and personal, calling it a national symbol of and sanctuary of imagination. This was the center before it was destroyed. Photographic archivist Marwan Tarazi, known as the guardian of Gaza's visual memory, was killed in the bombing of the St. Porphyrius Church along with his wife. His personal collection included photographs of Nakba refugees, Gaza's early years under occupation, and documentation of the first refugee camps. His death and destruction of his archive symbolized the erasure not only of Gaza's present, but also of its past. This is also another angle of the Rashad al-Shawwa Cultural Center. But the targeting has not been limited to modern institutions like the Rashad al-Shawwa Cultural Center. As archaeologist Dr. Hamdan Taha outlines in his policy paper, Destruction of Cultural Heritage in Gaza, which was published by IPS, some of the oldest and most historically significant sites in Gaza have been directly bombed or severely damaged. This is Tel al-Sakan, a Bronze Age city that dates back to over 5,000 years ago. This site is located in Zahra area, which I showed earlier, the before and after footage of. Heavily bulldozed, bombarded area. The odds that this Bronze Age city that was discovered, excavated, and buried to preserve it again, the odds that it survived are very, very low. It's really hard to know. The Anthedon Harbor, Gaza's ancient Mediterranean port listed on the UNESCO heritage site, is likely did not survive. This is Beit Saqqa, which is an important landmark in the heart of Gaza's old city, which also was severely bombed and damaged. And of course, Gaza's most important heritage site, the Great Omari Mosque, which was once a pagan temple, later a church, and then a mosque, was completely bombed and reduced to rubble. This is the mosque before it was destroyed. This is the Pasha Palace in the heart of Gaza City, severely damaged. This is Hammam Samara in the heart of Gaza City, severely damaged. The list goes on and on and on. Okay. So in international law, the destruction of cultural heritage during wartime is recognized under the Hague Convention as a war crime. Systematic nature of this destruction of Gaza, especially when combined with the targeting of civilians, hospitals, and education, places it firmly within the framework of cultural genocide. And when you destroy a school, you block a future, and destroy a hospital, you end a life. But when you destroy a library, an archive, a manuscript, a theater, you erase a people's past, present, and future. And if this isn't genocide, what is? And thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that very thorough presentation, Jehad. It's so important to remember all of these sites and to document the destruction of these places, these archives, these institutions. And too often, as we hear about what is happening on the ground in Gaza, we are hearing about individual incidents, we're hearing about casualties, we're hearing about starvation, all of which is important, but too often the loss of cultural heritage, which has been massive, is under discussed. So I really appreciate you highlighting these things in your comments. And I'd like to invite now Segal to present his introductory comments.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Yousef, and thank you to the Arab Center and the organizers. Last October, Israeli Jewish settlers and their supporters gathered right outside of the Gaza Strip in a closed military zone for an event titled Preparing to Settle Gaza. It included Israel Knesset as parliament members and government ministers. They discussed their vision of the complete expulsion of Palestinians from northern Gaza and the building of a new Israeli Jewish city on the ruins of Gaza City. Meanwhile, the Israeli army was moving forward in the brutal implementation of the so-called General's Plan, that is the intensified total siege on northern Gaza, accompanied by an attack by Israeli forces that at that time, in October 2024, killed on average more than 100 Palestinians a day, forcing thousands upon thousands to move south. This is precisely what Israeli Knesset member for the ruling Likud party, Ariel Kalner, called for already on the 7th of October 2023 on social media when he said, Nakba to the enemy now, Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 1948. Israeli cabinet minister Avi Dichter appeared on Israeli TV 2 months later, on 11th of November 2023, and openly described this, quote, second Nakba as the Gaza Nakba. As this example shows, Israeli soldiers and officers on the ground leave us no doubt that they understand perfectly well the destructive goals of the Israeli government in its attack on Gaza. Now, this marks a very important shift from Nakba denial as a structural element in Israel and the West since the 1948 Nakba to a discourse that now admits the Nakba as an ongoing process. Perpetrators of state violence rarely move from denial to recognition in this way, certainly not during unfolding violence. We see it in this case because of the perpetrator's state of mind. Israeli leaders, army officers, and soldiers who have documented their own crimes in Gaza in thousands of videos and proudly uploaded the evidence onto social media, they imagine that they are fighting a colonial war against, quote, human animals, as we remember Israel War Minister Yoav Gallant at the time describing Palestinians in Gaza on 9th of October 2023. Such explicit language, human animals, brings to mind the German General Lotto von Trotha, who issued an extermination order in response to the violent uprising of the Yara people against German colonial occupation in Southwest Africa in 1904. That order signaled the beginning of the German genocide of the Herero and Nama people. Similarly, Israelis perceived their genocidal assault on Palestinians after the Hamas attack on 7th of October as a war against, quote, colonized barbarians. Israel's attack on Gaza is, in other words, Israeli settler colonialism taken to its horrific conclusion. Israeli leaders have been explicit about their settler colonial ideology and policies. Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog, for instance, responded in an interview on MSNBC on 5th of December 2023 to a question about the large-scale killing of Palestinians in Gaza by saying that, quote, this is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas. That's how he started the answer. Not only between Israel and Hamas. It's a war that is intended really, truly to save Western civilization. We are attacked by a jihadist network, an empire of evil, and this empire wants to conquer the entire Middle East, and if it weren't for us, Europe would be next, and the United States follows. A month earlier, in late October and early November, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu referred a few times to the biblical story of Amalek in conjunction with the beginning of the Israeli ground invasion into the Gaza Strip. As is well known, this is a story of the Israelites destroying completely a people perceived as a whole as an enemy, as the ultimate evil. Herzog's portrayal of an empire of evil then placed the Amalek story on a modern scale as the last stand against global apocalypse and the demise, quote, of Western civilization. And we continue to hear this rhetoric until today. Herzog thus expressed a white supremacist rationalization of destruction of people under colonial occupation, but here taken to extreme, couched within a discourse of religious war that points to the Jewish supremacy as a manifestation of white supremacy at the heart of Israeli settler colonialism. Israeli leaders with command authority in international law have used such religious discourse from the beginning of their assault on Gaza, including numerous references to a struggle against evil, to Gaza as a, quote, city of evil, and statements about a war of the people of light against the people of darkness. As with admissions of Nakba and calls for a second Nakba, this discourse hardly remained confined to the leadership level, and officers and soldiers in the Israeli army have been mirroring it constantly on the ground in Gaza. It's important to explain that in international law, we also have to show connections. We have to show that the intent and the leadership level shapes the violence, the dynamics of violence on the ground. And because we have these thousands and thousands of videos of Israeli officers and soldiers, we can actually show that very clearly. So I want to give you some examples. A video created by Israeli soldiers in the Sajaiya neighborhood in Gaza on 8th of December 2023 shows them setting fire to a truck with food and water in it. It is the second day of Hanukkah, they narrate in their video. We are in a factory that makes candy that is given to children who carry out terror attacks. We are bringing the light to this dark place, burning it until there remains no remnant of it. Now, 3 days earlier, on 5th of December, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a message to Israelis and to Israeli soldiers and officers, and I quote from Netanyahu, "This week we will light the first candle of Hanukkah. Our soldiers will bring light to the darkness, in the alleyways of Gaza, in the ruins of Sajaiya, in the terrorist lairs in Khan Yunis. The light together as a great light will cleave the darkness." The video of the soldiers thus demonstrates how the vision of state leaders, couched again in religious language, shaped concrete actions of soldiers who actually, in this case, used the same words as Netanyahu in the exact place he mentioned just a couple days prior. On 21st of December 2023, to take another example, a platoon commander in a reserve battalion spoke in a public event in honor of the battalion and its role in Gaza. The reserve officer summarized the biblical story in Genesis 34, where Shimon and Levi, sons of Jacob, carry out a revenge attack against the people of Nablus in response to the rape of their sister. The reserve officer explained that what Shimon and Levi did in Nablus, his unit did in Bet Hanun in Gaza. But the mission is not complete, he added. We still have the whole of Gaza to do what we did in Bet Hanun. It's very important to note and to remind that Israeli leaders and Israeli officers have been telling us from the beginning what they plan to do, and then they did it. The Genesis 34 story, in fact, disapproves of the act of revenge. So this officer needed to distort the biblical text to fit it into the genocidal message he conveyed to his audience. This demonstrates that the issue at hand is not the established or accepted scholarly interpretations of biblical texts used to justify Israeli genocide, but the way Israeli Jews understand and use them. Captain Chai Chemo, deputy commander of a company, posted a video of himself on 13th of January 2024, explaining his understanding of the story of Amalek. And he says the following: with the help of God, we have destroyed a vast area of Gaza and killed tens of thousands of Amalek. But we are not yet a moral army. This is the real war of the people of Israel. Moral is to understand that every Arab is a suspect. Maybe he is good, maybe he is a bomb, but he is a suspect. Moral is to execute all the terrorists after interrogating them. Moral is to conquer and settle all of the land of Israel, and every place we will leave a wasp's nest. They will retaliate against us sooner or later. Chemo thus views the Amalek story as the basis of a moral framework that casts all Palestinians as enemies, as killable. All perpetrators of state violence, by the way, have moral frameworks, right? And this is an example. This is furthermore articulated within a call to occupy and settle the land of Israel, a religious construct, and Chemo concluded with explicit dehumanization, warning that Israelis should not leave any, quote, wasp's nest. These are just a few examples among thousands of videos by Israeli soldiers and officers that demonstrate a connection between explicit expressions by Israeli leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers of, quote, intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such, to quote from the UN 1948 UN Genocide Convention. So, connection between these expressions of intent to destroy and dynamics of violence on the ground. Indeed, Chemo understood Netanyahu's reference to Amalek as it was intended to mark Palestinians in Gaza as such, that is, all Palestinians in Gaza as enemies. The view of all Palestinians as such as enemies was also the basis of Israeli War Minister Gallant's total siege policies that he declared on 9th of October 2023 when he referred to Palestinians as human animals. And of course, cutting off a territory from food, clean water, fuel, medical supplies completely, total siege, which of course upgraded, quote unquote, the 16-year siege on Gaza beforehand, which is the longest in modern history. But total siege targets the people who live in the territory as a whole, as such, everyone, in the language of the convention. This total siege set the stage for the displacement that Israel forced on nearly the entire population of 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza since October 2023. The vast majority of Palestinians have experienced multiple forced displacement in conditions of starvations, almost no medical treatment, Israeli bombings of unprecedented intensity that have targeted everyone and everything, as we've heard, and Israeli forces on the ground led by officers such as Chemo. Taken together, Israeli policies and mass violence in Gaza since October 2023 have, quote, and I'm referring to the third kind of violence in the convention, deliberately inflicted on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Even if the genocide ends now, Palestinians in Gaza, as Yara explained, will continue to die because of the atrocious conditions that Israel has intentionally created, and the unprecedented destruction means that it will take decades decades to remove the rubble and rebuild. As in all cases of genocide, trauma and suffering will accompany Palestinian survivors and their descendants for decades and generations to come, because that's what genocide does. And for 20 months now, it continues. On 18th of March, Israel broke whatever remained of the ceasefire and renewed its genocidal assault on Palestinians in Gaza. The next day, Israel's current war minister, and I really insist that we call these people war ministers and not defense ministers, Israel Katz, said the following about this renewed violence and what's coming. The people of Gaza, notice, this is all very clear in front of our eyes. It doesn't require a degree in comparative literature. The people of Gaza, this is your last warning. The recent attack of the Israeli Air Force against Hamas terrorists was only the first step. The rest will be far more difficult, and you will pay the full price. Unless all Israeli hostages are released and Hamas expelled from Gaza, Israel will act with force that you have never seen. Take the advice of the US president, return the hostages and expel Hamas so that other possibilities open up for you, including leaving the Gaza Strip to other places in the world for those who would want that. The alternative is devastation and utter destruction. Notice the clear conflation of Hamas and all Palestinians in Gaza. Notice the clear conflation of military rationale and the intentional targeting of civilians. This is all in front of our eyes. It's been in front of our eyes for 20 months now. Like other Israeli leaders in the last 20 months, Katz's words very much exhibit genocidal intent. The reference to the so-called Trump plan for Gaza, that is the forced removal of all Palestinians from Gaza, is yet another indication of the settler colonial driving force in Israel's destruction of Gaza, the ongoing Nakba. When we think about the Holocaust, and I'm a scholar of the Holocaust, we ask ourselves, how could the world let that happen? In the case of Israel's genocide in Gaza, some of the world, primarily here, the US, Germany, and other Western allies of Israel, states allegedly committed to Holocaust memory and education, have not only let this happen, but they have facilitated the genocide through their military and diplomatic support of Israel. Even as the International Court of Justice has ruled 3 times in January, March, and May 2024 that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza, even as the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for war crimes and crimes against humanity against Netanyahu and Gallant, even as Amnesty International, as we heard, Human Rights Watch, and countless UN reports have determined that Israel's attack on Gaza fits the definition of the crime of genocide in international law. And even as a growing number of Holocaust and genocide studies scholars, dozens and dozens of Holocaust and genocide studies scholars now, and international law experts, including Jews and including Israelis, have also come to this conclusion. When we think about the Holocaust, we should also be thinking about, as Yara mentioned, the voices, the perspectives, and the knowledge of the Jews who had faced genocide, the voices of survivors. And if we take never again seriously, and we haven't, of course, but if we take never again seriously, we should now be forefronting the voices of Palestinians facing Israeli genocide and calling on us, calling on you, pleading urgently, desperately, to stop the violence, not to support the Israeli perpetrators, not to allow the flow of weapons to the violent Israeli state, not to give it diplomatic cover, but to stand with Palestinians and their struggle for truth and justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Raz. Before I turn it over to Sarah Leah, I just wanted to remind you all, we'll have a question and answer session after we conclude with introductory remarks. And please put your questions down on the question cards, raise your hand with them, and someone will come by to collect them. And those watching online can also send them in to Zoom or to the email events@arabcenterdc.org. Sarah Leah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, and it's so great to be here. And I think we've just heard very, very difficult presentations. My gut is just twisting listening to the testimonies that Yara was reading to us, reading the horrific statements from Israeli officials, seeing the images of Palestinian destruction in Gaza. It's really a punch in the gut, and I hope that what I'm going to focus on today will give us a feeling of power and strength. Because nearly 2 years into this genocide, I imagine that all of you, probably all of you who are here, are feeling extremely personally defeated and depressed and anxious and horrified. And I want to appeal to all of you not to give in to that feeling. And I hope that some of the information I'm going to present, which is really about civil society fighting back, will leave you feeling empowered. We understand clearly the challenge ahead of us, which is an actual real-time live stream genocide supported by our government here in the United States. But we also should see in the face of this incredible global civil society action that is the most important measure to stop the genocide, to end the occupation, and to end Israel's apartheid rule. There are tools available to us, and if we don't use the tools available to us, then what's happening in Gaza is also on us. So I hope that serves as encouragement more than anything else. As I think Agnes from Amnesty was noting, the efforts to end the genocide and to hold the perpetrators accountable is really a test not only of the international community's ability to stop a genocide, but also now is really a test for the survival of the global rules-based order itself, including in particular the two courts that are tasked with upholding the so-called global rules-based order, the edifice of international law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, in particular the Genocide Convention, and that is the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Together with efforts to use national courts to enforce domestic laws that prohibit arms transfers to abusive regimes like Israel's, together with the tools that states have and are currently using to try to sanction and punish Israel for its atrocities, they collectively represent, I think, what is in fact a tremendous opportunity to use the power of law and diplomacy and sanctions, which I should note are all peaceful tools, to pressure the Israeli government or the Israeli people into ending their crimes. These tools present a critical role in the global struggle for freedom and equality for Israel and Palestine. And so it's no surprise that the pro-Israel organizations are using every tactic they have to shut down the organizations and the activists behind these efforts. It's a very wide area to cover, so I'll briefly address the major categories of efforts of accountability and provide particular detail about the ICC's prosecution and Dawn's litigation here in the United States because I know them best. But also I want to make sure that there's time for question and answer, so feel free to interrupt me at any time. I won't be offended. As probably most of you know, on November 21, 2024, the ICC issued arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister, now former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as Hamas military leader Mohammed Deif, who's now been killed, as part of the proceedings in the court's ongoing investigation, which was opened in March 2021 for crimes committed on Palestinian territory since June 13, 2014. The court's judges concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Netanyahu and Gallant are responsible for the crimes identified in the Rome Statute, which is the statute that governs the International Criminal Court, and it based its charges only on their actions since October 8, 2023, so not going back to 2014, which is all within the court's jurisdiction, but specifically includes the starvation of civilians, intentionally directing attacks against civilian population, murder, and persecution. Now, there's a long history to the International Criminal Court's prosecution of Israel, which started 10 years ago. I'm not going to provide that useful information in the interests of time, but I do want to note that it took tremendous advocacy efforts by civil society, including our work at Human Rights Watch when I used to work there, over many years to persuade the Palestine Authority to join the International Criminal Court, and then more years of efforts and persuasion to persuade it to refer the case to the International Criminal Court. The Palestinian Authority came under tremendous pressure, not just from Israel, but also the United States and the United Kingdom, not to take these actions. And the Palestinian officials individually endured sanctions against them and punishments for the PA after they did so. We're very fortunate that after many years of hemming and hawing, the ICC agreed, first under former prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, to launch an examination and then to open an investigation after concluding that the matter met the criteria of the court, namely Israel's failure to prosecute its own war criminals. And the efforts to sanction the court for taking these actions started under the first Trump administration, when President Trump sanctioned prosecutor Bensouda and her colleagues at the prosecutor's office, as well as their families, to punish them for opening this investigation into Israel. In one of its first decisions, the court's pretrial chamber ruled that it does indeed have jurisdiction over the territory of the State of Palestine, as well as over the nationals of the State of Palestine, and confirmed that it has jurisdiction over anyone who commits crimes in Palestine, regardless of whether or not the crimes were committed by persons whose nationalities, whose countries are members of the court. This is the main Israeli challenge. Following the opening of the investigation, there have been numerous referrals to the International Criminal Court, with human rights organizations submitting evidence to the court about Israeli violations of the Rome Statute, but they've been primarily focused on the crimes committed by Israeli authorities without identifying the perpetrators, and the victims of the crimes, again, without identifying perpetrators. I think this shifted in 2023 with Dawn, my organization's first submission to the court in December of 2023, when we urged the prosecutor to investigate 40 Israeli military commanders who had taken part or had command responsibility over operations in Gaza at the start of the war, including using starvation as a weapon. I believe this was the first submission focused on identifying the perpetrators that we believe that the court should investigate. In October 2024, so just late last year, the Hind Rajab Foundation took this a dramatic step further, filing a historic complaint with the ICC, a so-called Article 15 communication, identifying 1,000 IDF soldiers, accusing them of war crimes and violations of the Rome Statute, interestingly and importantly, relying on the social media posts of IDF soldiers themselves advertising their own war crimes. It has followed up these submissions by asking states to arrest these named Israeli soldiers who turn up in their country. We had the opportunity at Dawn to target the American officials who have aided and abetted Israel's atrocities in Gaza. In January, we submitted a 200-page communication to the court urging it to indict U.S. officials, former President Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin for their roles in aiding and abetting, as well as intentionally contributing to Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. These referrals may result in indictments, may result in arrest warrants, and if you look at the recent arrest warrant issued against former Philippines President Duterte, they take often many, many years, if not decades. And the wheels of international justice are slow, but what these Israeli officials who already are facing arrest warrants, the additional arrest warrants that are likely to be issued against other Israeli officials, and the American officials whom we've recommended also face arrest and indictment, is that this will continue to hang over their heads because the prosecution will remain ongoing. And we hope that that will serve as a deterrent. As many of you probably know, there are very serious sexual harassment allegations against the prosecutor, Prosecutor Karim Khan, which has thrown a new curveball into the proceedings. He has stepped down pending the investigation, and there are now 2 acting prosecutors. Of particular concern in this regard is that Prosecutor Khan rushed the arrest warrants to deflect from the allegations against them. The United States has imposed new sanctions against 4 judges of the International Criminal Court, including those who had voted to support not only the arrest warrants against the Israeli officials, but in a prior, now closed, effectively closed case investigation of U.S. crimes in Afghanistan. Israel has also won on its appeal to revisit the issue of jurisdiction in the ICC case because in April of this year, the appeals chamber, to make a technical and complicated legal question short, basically allowed Israel to challenge again the jurisdiction of the court over it, and so the matter is now back before the pretrial chamber. The International Court of Justice cases are also 2 incredibly important cases that have provided us with the legal tools available to us to help stop the genocide in Gaza. One is the ongoing genocide case initiated by South Africa against Israel for breaching the Genocide Convention. South Africa presented evidence that Israel's actions are genocidal. Several other countries have joined or expressed support for the case, including the Maldives, Turkey, Spain, Mexico, Libya, Chile, and Ireland. The ICJ has held hearings on the case and issued provisional measures, including as late as May 2024, regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza, ordering it to halt its offensive specifically in Rafah. Sadly, Israel has ignored the court's provisional orders, and there have been no steps by the international community to enforce the court's provisional orders. Furthermore, in April, Israel secured a 6-month delay in the ICJ case, asking the court for more time to submit its rebuttal to South Africa's allegations against it, which pushes the original deadline now to January 2026. Again, international justice is slow. More significantly, in terms of the wheels of justice and the wheels of accountability moving, is the ICJ's advisory opinion concluding in 2024 that Israel's occupation, its prolonged occupation of Gaza, is illegal and must come to an end, that Israel must withdraw its settlers and end its settlement regime in occupied Palestine, and that Israel is engaging in the crimes of apartheid and persecution. Following that opinion, the General Assembly of the UN took actions to try to enforce the advisory opinion. Significantly, there is a conference taking place next week, coordinated by Saudi Arabia and France, that will address specifically the ICJ opinion's mandate for the global community, for the international community, to end its support for Israel in the maintenance of its occupation and apartheid regime. And Dawn is issuing a series of recommendations to this conference. It is a very important opportunity. I want to jump quickly to the universal jurisdiction cases to note that there have been probably over a dozen efforts to spur investigations and charges against Israeli soldiers who turn up in countries where there are universal jurisdiction laws, or Israeli dual national soldiers returning home after their term of genocide in Gaza. They are primarily relying on referrals to court prosecutors because almost every universal jurisdiction law in countries that have them require the state to actually bring the charges against the perpetrators of war crimes that occur outside their country. To date, although there are two important investigations underway, one in Canada and one in Belgium that the prosecutors have brought forward, none of them have yet resulted in charges or indictments. There have also been domestic efforts to enforce arms transfer laws in countries around the world, and most of those efforts have been blocked as addressing political questions in the United States. Again, Dawn, my organization, is trying a different approach, including with my colleague Cobb Blaha, formerly of the State Department, to challenge the U.S. government's failure to enforce a particular portion of laws restricting arms transfers, and that is the Leahy law. And our argument there isn't just that the United States has breached its law, but that it has done so in an arbitrary and capricious manner, violating the Administrative Procedures Act. We hope this will overcome the political question challenge, and the judge has ordered the government to enter into settlement negotiations with us, about which we're quite optimistic. Let me conclude by saying, and hopefully in the Q&A I can address more, that there has been an unprecedented actions by governments around the world to sanction Israeli officials, even if it's just for their crimes in the West Bank, to impose arms embargoes on Israel to varying degrees, including by several European states, and to end or suspend or diplomatic relations with Israel, including the withdrawals of ambassadors. This is exactly the scenario that we want and need, to impose the global pressure on Israel, to isolate it as a pariah state so that Israelis can hopefully voluntarily come to the conclusion that they do not want the government that is prosecuting the genocide in Gaza and the ongoing occupation to remain in place. And what we hope to offer is a peaceful transition for Israel to end its atrocities and rejoin the community of nations. But these are incredibly important efforts, and I really encourage everyone to do your part to support these positive efforts and accountability, as challenging as they are, because there is a historic and unprecedented opportunity paid for by the blood of Palestinian men, women, and children. We cannot allow their deaths to be in vain. From the outside, these are the tools available to us to do what we can to support holding Israel and Israeli officials accountable, most importantly, ending the genocide in Gaza and ending the occupation of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah Leah, and to all of you for your comments. We have some time for Q&A now. Please do keep sending in your questions either here in the room or online, and we have a number of them that we can get started with. Yara, maybe I'll start with you. We have a question that comes to us from an online viewer that says women and children have been bearing the brunt of this genocide. Can you comment on the use of reproductive violence and how it has played a role in the genocide?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pointing to that, especially I think when we consider the genocidal intent question, the question of births in the population is such a significant one. We know from decades, perhaps centuries of research on settings of armed conflict that in general, women and children bear the brunt. So I think there's a common misconception because most combatants are men, that most people killed or harmed will be men. And that is often true in the battle period. But there's a couple things that come as a consequence of that. One, especially in more patriarchal societies like that in Palestine, when a man is killed, a son, an uncle, often the breadwinner of the family or the main provider of the family is also killed, and the women and children are then left economically, essentially, with nothing. So we've heard many, many accounts of this where women and children have survived or have been able to flee while perhaps the father stayed behind. And are absolutely destitute because they have no access to resources, no money, obviously no health care. And so we often find that the long tail of death after or in the process of a very protracted armed conflict is much more likely to affect women and children. So they are more likely to die when we look at the holistic picture. The question of reproductive justice, I think when you have a situation where women have absolutely no access to any health care while pregnant, while giving birth, in the postnatal months, when you have a perhaps nursing infant, it cannot be overstated how dangerous this is. The increase in infant and maternal mortality is one of the main causes for indirect deaths during war. This is, I think, as the theme of all of us has been, this is by design, this is intentional. There are ways to, there have been many NGOs that have tried to increase the midwives that have been distributed, to offer more medical evacuations for high-risk pregnancies. All of these mechanisms have been denied. Every potential solution, every potential way to give at least dignity to these people has been absolutely denied. So I think we should see the reproductive injustice as part and parcel of this entire intent to first displace. If you want medical care, you're going to have to leave. And we heard many instances where people who did receive approval for medical evacuations had to sign documents that ensured that they did not return to Gaza. So leave, go to Egypt, go to Jordan, get your medical care, and then figure out your life from there. You're not able to return. And that includes with high-risk pregnancies and very young newborns who needed medical care. So this is being used as a tool of displacement, of death. It remains unknown what the long-term consequences intergenerationally of this will be, but it will be a generational fracture in Palestinian history that will continue even for those who survive this genocide.
Thank you, Yara. Sarah Leah, I'll go to you next. This isn't necessarily addressed to you, but I think perhaps it deals with the responses. So it's maybe something you can tackle. What's your view of the new campaign calling for state or military intervention to stop the genocide?
This is something we have been very closely deliberating about with Dawn and a number of partner organizations to think about how we can approach the issue of humanitarian intervention or so-called humanitarian intervention. I think that, I guess, to start out with, Dawn opposes a unilateral military intervention that's not authorized by the United Nations because we have seen that used catastrophically, particularly throughout the Middle East, including in Iraq, which I'll remind you was justified. The invasion of Iraq was justified in the name of a humanitarian intervention. Practically speaking, the opportunities for an actual military intervention, even just a no-fly zone, I think is appropriate and suitable were the United Nations to authorize it. But of course, there is no prospect of the UN Security Council authorizing that and would certainly veto any efforts to do that, just as it would veto and the United States has vetoed even mere ceasefire resolutions. So I think, practically speaking, it's not clear how it could be achieved. Theoretically, there could be a coalition of states that do oppose the Israeli genocide, China among them, for example, that I think would be well within their rights to assemble a coalition to protect the Palestinian people at least from further bombardment. But how that plays out, in the vision, in the minds of many, is a third world war of the United States coming to Israel's defense should any state try to protect Palestinians militarily from further assault. What we are calling for in our recommendations, however, is the authorization and mandate of peacekeeping forces in Gaza that we hope could effectively serve as a stop on further Israeli atrocities. And the state of Palestine has already consented to such peacekeeping forces. I imagine that most states would want Israeli consent. It's not implausible, however, that should the international community say to Israel, it's either you consent to peacekeeping forces or further sanctions, broader sanctions against Israel, it may consent to them. Complicated topic.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Roz, we'll turn to you next. There's a couple of questions that are very closely related that deal with views inside Israel today, dehumanization of Palestinians, and support for the genocide, among other crimes. Haaretz recently reported on a poll that revealed that some 82% of Israelis back the expulsion of the population in Gaza. Is this, the questioner asked, a reflection of embedded biblical narratives or deep-rooted hateful rhetoric in Israeli society? You touched on some of that in your remarks. And to what extent is reform viable, in tandem with a long-term solution?
Thank you. Dehumanization of Palestinians in Israeli Jewish society is very deep, and for example, the description of Palestinians as Nazis, which is another form of dehumanization, right, has a long history from 1948, from the 1948 Nakba, and there's some well-known examples of Yasser Arafat in Beirut in 1982, described as Hitler in his bunker in Berlin, and these sort of things. Consider the way that for decades, phrases like "dirty Arab" have been used in Israeli society. So the dehumanization and denigration of Palestinians is very, very deep in Israeli society. It's tied to also, as I mentioned, to religious discourses, to the depiction of Palestinians as Amalek, and it's rooted in a Jewish supremacist framework in a Israeli settler colonial framework that is really about the greater Israel idea, right? Creating a greater Israel on maximum territory of the land of Israel as a religious construct with minimum or ideally no Palestinians at all. And there's so many examples. We can think about how, quote unquote, United Jerusalem's borders were created after the 1967 war, again, exactly according to this greater Israel idea of, maximum land, Jerusalem in this case, minimum Palestinians. In terms of thinking in long term, right here, we have to understand this is not unique to the Israeli case. This kind of social and political atmosphere doesn't change quickly at all. It's an intergenerational process. Think about it. The 1945 Nazi Germany is defeated, right? Does that mean that millions and millions and millions of Nazis in Germany, changed their mind? Look at Germany today. That's another issue. But apartheid, South Africa falls. Does that mean that so many people give up on their white supremacy? No, it doesn't happen that way. What's important is the change of the political structures. That's what's important, and that's what creates the condition then for this long-term process, right? That maybe in some way changes, people's minds, or, again, it's an intergenerational process, it's an educational process. And here what's important to say is that there is very many indications that Israeli society is falling apart right now, right? Economically, socially, politically. It'll take time. It's been falling apart for quite a long time within this genocide now. But there are very many ways to make sure that it continues to fall apart. Sanctions, pressures of civil society that we've seen from the very beginning of this genocide around the world are very important to strengthen, to support, to continue, to make sure that Israeli Jews and the many, many Israeli Jewish war criminals, right, understand that they're not wanted, that there is pressure to arrest them, that they have excluded themselves, right, from however we want to describe, the world in that sense. So this is, in terms of thinking about long-term, and of course long-term means that, as in the apartheid, South Africa is a good, and I'll finish with that, a good example, is that this long-term process, long-term vision in which this process of change will happen means that it cannot be a Jewish state. Right? It needs to be a state where everyone there, Jews, Palestinians, and others, right, has equal rights, their dignity is treated equally, their belonging to the place is treated equally, right? That's the change of the political structure. So helping Israeli society to continue to fall apart, I think, is a very important piece in that. But the dehumanization, the racism, and the white supremacy, and the Jewish supremacy, that will remain with us for a very long time, unfortunately.
Thank you, Raz. I just want to stay with you for 1 second on a separate question, if you could address it, because we did get a question that asked about sort of pre-2003. And, in my opening remarks today, I mentioned something that was written by a number of genocide scholars in 2009. In a class that I was teaching recently on Palestine, when we talked about genocide, we looked at articles that were written, for example, by Nadia Hijab back in 2010, asking the question, when does it become a genocide? And others by Mohammed Nijam, for example, who asked similar questions, and looks at the pre-2023 period. And I guess my question is, in the conversation around assessing what's happening as genocide, where does that period fit into the assessment, especially around intentionality, considering you have, the policies of siege, right, going back to 2007? Where does that fit in to the analysis around genocide and the conversations about this today?
I would say, again, very briefly, it's a very big question. I would say that there's no way to understand Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza without placing it in the frame of Israeli settler colonialism, at the very least, actually, since the 1948 Nakba, but actually, Zionist settler colonialism predates the 1948 Nakba, of course, right? So we cannot understand the genocide in Gaza now without, in some way, understanding it in a longer process of destruction, right? That even if we cannot fit it into the international law about the crime of genocide, right, we can definitely say that it's about elimination, destruction, forced displacement, removal, about creating a greater Israel, right, with maximum territory and minimum or no Palestinians. So it's, I think that's the shortest way to refer to that. That international law is one sphere of engaging with Israel's attack on Gaza now, destructive attack on Gaza, but it's not the only one, right? And yes, we are talking about an ongoing Nakba, an ongoing process of destruction for decades and decades now.
Thank you, Raz. And we'll close here with a question to you, Jehad, about information that's available. To what extent is there documented, disaggregated data available that maps the displacement of Palestinians to other countries, especially data around age group segmentation and children, whether they're accompanied or orphaned? And what are the primary sources or institutions responsible for this data?
I'm not personally familiar with any dedicated effort that seeks to document this kind of data, even though I think it is important that some organization starts working on that. There can be political and legal challenges, especially when it comes to documenting the large wave of Palestinians who left Gaza or were forced to leave Gaza, who could afford it, who could afford leaving Gaza and were forced to leave Gaza during the months of the genocide prior to the occupation of Rafah. Rough estimates, talk about 100 to 150,000 Palestinians from Gaza who left between October 2023 and April 2024. And most of these people, the great majority of them, are currently in Egypt. Those were, people who were either from Gaza's business or upper or middle classes who were able to afford the hefty fees that we all know about from back then, which reached sometimes between $5,000 to $7,000, sometimes $10,000 per one person. So, this community, this diaspora that formed in Egypt in a very short period of time, we don't have a lot of information about them. I personally don't know what the Palestinian Authority Embassy in Cairo is doing to support them. But I know that these people are on their own. They're technically illegal in Egypt, even though they're considered, like in the abstract sense, guests. They're able to rent homes and apartments. They're able to, live and just, move on with their lives. Those who were able to reopen their businesses were able to do so. There is, if you go to Medinat Nasser in Cairo now, some of Gaza's, top bakeries, dessert shops, even grocery stores reopened there or are attempting to recover. And of course, from that community that ended up in Egypt, there were people who ended up in Europe, but their ability to leave Egypt is limited because in order for you to apply to a visa to go to Europe or to the United States or other parts of the world, you have to prove that you are a legal resident of the country where you're staying. So since these people don't have papers in Egypt, they cannot apply for visas to go to Europe, for example, and apply for political asylum. So this is an important, something we need to know what the status of these people is like and how their future is discussed between the key stakeholders, Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, and other actors in the region. So yeah, I think it's an important question, and I'm grateful for the person who asked it, and it's something that we'll look into doing something more structured and analytical about it in the short term.
Thanks very much, Jehad, and thank you to all of our panelists for their contributions in this panel, and for all of you who joined and participated. That will conclude our panel for now. We ask that you join us for lunch, an abbreviated lunch as we went a little bit over. We'll have 45 minutes for that in the Bloomberg room next door. And please meet us back here at 1 p.m. for a sneak peek of Palestine Explained, a brand new online resource for information on Palestine. We'll see you in a little bit. Thank you.